Welcome to the Italian Renaissance podcast, where we discuss the culture and art of 15th and 16th century Italy. I'm your host, Lawrence Ginangeli. Andiamo avanti. Renaissance people, welcome back to the Italian Renaissance podcast. And today I am really excited to welcome onto the show Eleanor Walker, who is going to talk to us about one of the most compelling figures of the Renaissance, Isabella d'Este. Isabella d'Este is a perfect bridge between everything we've been talking about so far with the Este court in Ferrara, because she's going to marry into the Gonzaga court in Mantua. So, Renaissance people, if you have not listened to the episodes on Ferrara and on Mantua, do so, because this is going to be a critical sort of linking figure between those two courts. Our guest today, Eleanor Walker, is a history of art graduate from both the University of Warwick and London's prestigious Courtauld Institute. She's a specialist in the art of the Italian Renaissance, in particular the influence of Netherlandish painting in 15th century Florence, and importantly, more recently, she's been researching the women of the Italian Renaissance. She's worked at Sotheby's and the Portland Gallery in London, and as a lecturer has taught for art history abroad. In 2020, she joined Stanford University's Florence program on art history and Italian contemporary culture, assisting Monsignor Timothy Verdon, a giant in art history. In 2024, she was part of the team for the opening of the first major museum for female artists in Europe, the Female Artist of the Museum in Mougins. Okay. FAMM, which exhibits masterpieces from the Levitt collection. Alongside her lecturing and leading high-end art programs, she now works as a collections manager for Christian Levitt's private collection in Florence of art by women artists. Eleanor, thank you for joining us on the show.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me.
So let's jump right into this. We need to talk about Isabella d'Este. Like I said, the listeners have already been introduced to both the Este and the Gonzaga courts. Can you introduce us to who Isabella d'Este is and help us understand where she fits in between these two major seats of power?
Great, yeah. So Isabella d'Este is a fascinating figure. She's probably one of the more well-known female Renaissance women in history, just because she leaves such a mark because of her collecting and her personality. And also she was a prominent, or at least maybe not prominent, but she wrote a lot of letters. I mean, she must have been at her desk all the time writing letters. If we were to fast forward and put her into the 20th century, she would be on her phone texting all the time. But she was born, as you say, in Ferrara, to the court of Ferrara in 1474. So towards the end of the 15th century. So the Renaissance in Florence is really taking over. The Medici are taking over in Florence, and the Este court is also a court that is really leading. It's very avant-garde in Italy at its time. Her father, Ercole d'Este, was a fantastic patron of the arts, very cultivated, very into his music. Actually, we have a lot to thank Ercole d'Este for his patronage of music, and he was also a very savvy political mind as well. So was her mother, his wife, Eleanor of Naples. She was a fantastic political mind, and she also served as regent in Ferrara when her husband was away. So Isabella grew up in this household of rich, intelligent, cultivated, politically driven people. So she was herself a very engaged young lady. She was able to speak Greek and Latin fluently at the age of 6, and is said to speak Virgil and Terence by heart to visitors to the court. She also engaged with ambassadors to the court on political issues as well. She was talking to various different people who would visit her father, and she would engage with various different issues, mainly to do, I will say, with her father's nemesis, which was Pope Sixtus IV, the Della Rovere Pope, who we have to thank for the Sistine Chapel, who was a real rival to her father. And really, on that note, her father's patronage of music and arts was to rival that of the Vatican. So there's a lot of sort of political drive in the patronage of art in her sort of childhood home. And she is also said to have been the favorite daughter of her father. So she's the eldest. She's the eldest of 6 children that are born. And her sister, Beatrice, or Beatrice as we pronounce it, is a year younger. And there's a sort of whole story with these 2 sisters who get sort of married off to Mantua, to the Gonzaga court, and then to the Duke of Milan, which was her sister. So that's a whole other box of frogs, should we say? But no, Isabella was highly intelligent, highly driven, and very capable young woman who lived actually for quite a long time. She dies when she's 63, so she's able to really make her mark on the court in Mantua. Does that give you a sort of idea as to who she was?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So she's wed to Federico Gonzaga, and this is really where we start to see Isabella become a patron as the Marquess of Mantua in the Gonzaga court. Duchess or Marquess? Marquesa at this point. So this leads to an important question about the sort of work that you do. I want us to get a bit into the background of the position of women in the Renaissance, specifically Isabella, because we've talked so much about Borso d'Este, Leonello, their patronage. We talked about Ercole. We talked about Ludovico Gonzaga. But patronage changes when it's from a female perspective. And I wonder what you can inform us about the limitations of the ladies of the court and how that impacts their patronage, or if it impacts their patronage at all.
Yeah, it's really fascinating actually, because especially with Isabella d'Este, purely because the court is a princely court, not a republican court. So Florence, for example, is a republican court, and the women of Florence, there are clearly some fascinating leaders, fascinating women of Florence, but their roles were much more domesticized. They were much more expected to stay within the confines of their palaces, whereas the court in Ferrara was a princely court, i.e., a court that was ruled by a lord and their consort, which means there's a different balance of power. And actually, women who were in part of that court, particularly the consort, was expected to rule in her husband's absence. Now, this we don't see in Florence so much. Obviously, we do with Eleonora and Cosimo the First, in the 1500s. But really, Isabella, she takes quite a role as a leader, purely also because her husband dies quite early on and she has to act on behalf of her elder son. So she really does become a leader of Ferrara, but she still has to tread that delicate line, as women often did and still do, of being in inverted commas, a woman for all intents and purposes. So one great example I can sort of show you with this is the decoration of her studiolo. So
Can you explain what a studiolo is? This is very important.
yeah, so a studiolo generally is a place where somebody will, or a ruler or a noble person, will keep their most treasured possessions. It is the most private and sort of, dare I use the word, sacred of spaces in a domestic home that you would be invited in as a privileged guest to see, but also the person whose studiolo it was, they would write maybe their most intimate letters in there, or they would discuss their most intimate conversations in there. It's a very important space, but it's sort of semi-private, semi-public, this space. And it's sort of really, I guess maybe you could, I don't know if you could make this comparison of being a sort of profile, a sort of, if you imagine somebody's profile today shows you what they want you to see, this is what a studiolo is. It shows you how intelligent they are, the things that they're reading, the art that they like, the gems and jewels they collect. Much as with on, Instagram or social media, whatever, we only show what we want people to see. Okay, so a studiolo is that. And so Isabella had a studiolo, and she decorates it with images of subjects celebrating chastity and purity and beauty, that all have, links with classical antiquity, these stories of these great goddesses who sort of, say no, and or are powerful female heroines as well. In contrast, her brother, Alfonso d'Este, who roughly at the same time decorates his studiolo. Now, this is in Ferrara, it's not in Mantua, it's different, but as an example, his scenes of ancient subjects from classical antiquity are scenes of lust and sex. So you sort of see she still has to present herself as this sort of powerful but womanly figure, womanly as it was interpreted then, and so really that becomes part of her identity. But she treads that line so beautifully. She's known as this kind of quite forefront person, but she's described by people of the time as the first lady of the world. And there's this wonderful quote here by this monk, actually, that we have to thank for, and it's probably a whole nother podcast we could do, for Two Gentlemen of Verona and Much Ado About Nothing. But Matteo Bandello, he writes about her and he says that she is supreme among women. So she clearly is able to tread this line, and she's very, very conscious of her image as a woman and as a leader.
That's great. And actually, listeners were introduced to Matteo Bandello with a conversation we had with Michael Cortotti, who does the translations of Bandello to, we were talking about Romeo and Juliet, that Matteo Bandello had written the sort of progenital story for. Very interesting, very interesting. And one of the paintings that comes to mind from her studiolo, we spoke about Mantegna in the last podcast, his Camera Picta, but he paints for Isabella d'Este, who, based on what I was reading, sort of found his style a little old-fashioned, right? But he paints this triumph of virtue, which is titled Parnassus, right? And it has this sort of moralizing, allegorical reading, but is sort of pictorially in line with what we were talking about with Alfonso d'Este's Studiolo, which those are the Gentile Bellini, Titian, Rosso Dossi paintings that have like the Triumph of Bacchus.
Yeah.
I got that right. Yeah. Very interesting. So what we end up with in any case is a different type of patronage, but still quite a lot of power and prestige. One of the things that I always try to remind my students of is we have to understand these power structures, these gendered power structures, but when we're talking about Renaissance history, we're always talking about the elite. We're always talking about the people with the most money and the most power. And yes, there are layers of power within the upper class of power, but not everyone got a portrait. Right, that's what we're going to talk about. Isabella d'Este's portraits, which is probably when we talk about the art history of Isabella d'Este, her portraits are usually among the most popularly discussed works. And you've selected for us Titian's portrait from 50. My dates are 1530 to 1539, something like 1536-ish, and ultimately the impact of that. We talk a lot on this show, the impact of Titian, especially after the Renaissance. So I want to give the floor to you, Renaissance people. This, if you are wanting to reference this image as we talk about it, is Titian's portrait of Isabella d'Este, about 1436. I'm going to give the floor back to Eleanor for walking us through this image.
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Renaissance people, if you are enjoying the Italian Renaissance podcast, I have good news. We're now active on Patreon. You can show your love for the show by becoming a patron and get access to additional resources, information, and artworks. Better yet, those who join the Renaissance Master or Renaissance Patron tier will get access to at least one additional podcast episode each month. My goal is to ensure that the main podcast remains a free, accessible source for everyone. Become a patron today through the link in the show notes to support the continued production of new episodes and help build and maintain this community. The Italian Renaissance shop is now also active on Etsy, linked in the show notes. Sport our logo or choose from a growing selection of Italian art-inspired designs. Discounts are offered to select Patreon tiers as well. Your support has my immortal gratitude. Now, enjoy the show.
Great. So this portrait done at the beginning of the 16th century, it's fascinating, really. It's known as Isabella in Black by Titian. Now, the really interesting thing first to say is the dating of this portrait, because it's dated. I mean, I think I have this date 1436. Isabella's dates. She's born in 1474, and she dies in 1539, which makes her aged 62 when looking at this portrait. And if you have it in front of you now, she's not a woman of 62 years old. She is a young woman, powerful woman. Um, One of the main things about Isabella d'Este, as well as her patronage, is her fashions. Both her and her sister were leaders in Renaissance fashion, and they took a lot of fashion actually from the French, or inspired by French fashion tradition at the time. But you can see here that she's got this fantastic garment on with this sort of fur that's sort of going over her shoulder. And then you can see on her sleeves there's a pattern on her sleeves, which is specific to Isabella, which is fascinating. So it's called Fantasia de Vinci, a pattern of knots, which is her personal emblem and comes up in her portraiture. She's wearing this sort of white underground camicia. A zarzara is what she's wearing on her head, this sort of turban headpiece, which you can see in her portraits. And she wears this sort of, it's made fashionable by her. Anyway, so she's sort of really communicating who she is in what she wears, which is something that women actually could do. They could really have a lot of power and impact on how they presented themselves and what they choose to wear. Anyway, so we clearly see this wealthy, powerful woman. And we actually have her talking about it in her own words. And I'll get to a minute as to why she looks this young, but bear with me with this quote, because she says, "The portrait by Titian's hands is of such a pleasing type that we doubt that we were ever, at that age that he represents, of such beauty that is contained in it." And it's so clever, this quote. It's so clever because, of course, you want to say, no, but of course, Isabella, of course you were that beautiful. Of course you were that, stunning, because she is extremely vain, is Isabella. And she actually was quite a difficult person to do a portrait for because she was very, very exacting as to how she wanted to be presented. She often censored herself. She often changed portraits. She often provided a written description to the artist as to how she wanted to be presented, which of its time is not unusual, but she was particularly, shall we say, precise. Anyway, the reason why this portrait is as young as it is because it is a copy of an original that's now lost, which was also a copy of another original. So the sort of first original, shall we say, if it's not too confusing, was a portrait by Francesco Franca, made 25 years earlier, which itself was based on another portrait. So you have a copy of a copy of a copy. And this is not unusual. Think about, at this time, you've got Elizabeth I, okay, roughly of this time, who's also highly precise or exact about how she wants to be portrayed, and that she's clearly that she presents herself as the queen that never ages. And I think this is similar to Isabella here. She wants to be remembered as this young, beautiful, and sort of ideal bride. Really, she wants to be seen as this sort of, dare I say, fertile young woman as well, because that's clearly so important. She goes on. She has 6 children after difficulties, I will say, with having children. But she really wants this to be kind of a portrait of her and reflect her, whilst it might not be an accurate portrait of her this point in time, which makes it kind of, and I think, fascinating. Rona Goffin, who writes in Titian's Women, she states that Isabella made herself the object of portrayal more often than any of her contemporaries, male or female. So she's clearly knows the power of her image. And, even if you swing over to the mid 16th century Florence, Eleonora di Toledo is doing exactly the same thing. She knows how to present herself and the importance of how she dresses and how she presents herself to her contemporaries at the time. But it also is fascinating because it shows the sort of contemporaneous expectations for women to be beautiful and what beauty was then. I mean, Titian, he's famous for his Titian blondes, and here she is blonde. She would have dyed her hair. Her hair is naturally brunette, but brunette and curly would suggest a sort of slightly unruly, creative woman. Here she's ideal, calm, tranquil, blonde, golden blonde woman, which was, hair also spoke a lot about who the woman was and actually how their mind worked. Strangely enough, it was interpreted with how their hair. And if you want to know more on that, there's a fantastic book that I would recommend called How to Be a Renaissance Woman. It's just a brilliant, brilliant book, and you'll find out more about these elements of how women would present themselves. But so this is why I wanted to start with this portrait, because it's an interesting one for us to think about how women wanted to present themselves and the censoring of their own images within this kind of society that they're living.
You mentioned you wanted to talk about this portrait in relation to an artist that is beyond my scope, and I'm really excited that you wanted to talk about him because I never ever get to talk about Peter Paul Rubens. So Rubens is going to do a copy of this portrait that is a copy of a copy of a copy. Talk to us about Rubens' intervention in this history.
Yeah, so Rubens, in fact, this is when we're grateful for artists to copy works, because if we lose the original, then look, we've got this wonderful copy. So Rubens comes and does this copy in about 1605, it's dated, of Isabella, and it's called Isabella d'Este in red. They get so creative with these titles. And you can see it is a very, very different image. You have the main features, of course. You have her wearing this zarzara, this wonderful turban. She's wearing, pearls and gems, and she's got this dress. But the dress also shows you quite how large Isabella was at the end of her life. She's said to have had struggles with her weight throughout her life. It's something that she comments on. She actually talks about her sister, saying her sister isn't greater than her, she's just bigger than her. She's quite ruthless, Isabella. I think if we met her, she probably wouldn't have been the nicest of person to meet. She would have been very critical as to how a woman or even a man presents herself. But anyway, we have this copy of an original Titian by Rubens when he sort of comes across this work, and she's shown in a less ideal way. I mean, clearly it's still heavily censored. It's a portrait, it's a painted portrait, and the original by Titian, I'm sure Isabella d'Este would have been as exacting with that portrait as she was with the rest of her things. But here she's shown as an older woman who's clearly had children, and she's a larger woman, and the dress doesn't necessarily flatter a sort of smaller figure. It sort of really does sort of show that she's a bit heavier than she was when she was 25 or even younger. And she supposedly didn't like that portrait for that very reason, because it was you know not as flattering. And it's fascinating to see, because it's probably more accurate to the women that we maybe would have met if we had ever would have got the chance to meet her in another universe. But it's also a copy of another Titian, so we can sort of have to sort of interpret the fact that it's another copy of a copy. And maybe Rubens himself adjusted things. We know Rubens for his wonderfully fleshy women that he does in his works. I mean, when you look at the Rubens women, they're wonderful to look at, because they're more realistic to an actual female body when you see his work. And yet you have this kind of quite controlled, quite sort of stilted portrait of Isabella looking out towards us and engaging with us. There's less of her in a way speaking to us here than perhaps the overly censored one from 1536.
I think this is really interesting, especially thinking about Isabella d'Este as having an afterlife, right? The idea of Rubens certainly knowing who he was replicating, and just to clarify, because I think I sort of confused this when I was asking you the question. The first one that we looked at, the 1536 one, is a painting by Titian. The Rubens copy is a copy of a lost painting by Titian. So it's not a copy of the first one we talked about. So that means somewhere in this history, there was another painting made by Titian, which we only have that original by Rubens. If I didn't follow that, excuse me. I was just looking at those differences, going, wait a minute, this is no copy. Um, so thank you for clarifying that. Renaissance people, this is sort of the story that we have for Isabella d'Este. I think, Eleanor, you painted a wonderful picture of what sounds like a vibrant personality and a very interesting person. I also read that when she first arrived in the Gonzaga court, that Mantegna initially did a portrait and she rejected it. She said, "No, that's not going to work for me. We're going to have to get someone else around here to handle this." So I want to thank you for your really valuable insights and your exciting portrayal, so to speak, of Isabella d'Este. And for final thoughts on this, I realize that you've recently worked with some brilliant people to put out a book, and I was hoping you would tell us a little bit about that, so I can link it in the show notes so that people can have access to your work.
Great, yeah. So I, as well as obviously being a great lover of Renaissance art and women in the Renaissance, I also love 20th century, and I've just been working on this wonderful book called Women in Their Own Words, which is a collection of quotes of female artists that belong to the Levitt collection. So this is a collection which belongs to Christian Levitt, who's an art collector based here in Florence, and he collects only female artworks. So it sort of has a pair with my interest in the Renaissance and female works. But we put together this book, which has about 95, I think, nearly 100 artists, and a work which is in his collection. And beside it is their own words, with the idea of giving women's voices back, putting them back into the fore, so that we can look through these artworks and hear these women talking about either the piece that you're looking at or talking about their process, so we can understand who these women were or are, and how they present themselves or how they present various subjects in their artworks. And you have a range of artists from, beginning in the 1860s with Mary Cassatt, with Eva Gonzalez, who was very, very tricky to find any kind of her own words in history. All the way through, the Surrealists, Leonora Carrington, Leonor Fini, to the Abstract Expressionists, Elaine de Kooning and Lee Krasner, all the way to 20th century, 21st century with Tracy Emin and Sarah Lucas and Cecily Brown. So it's a wonderful sort of little book that you can get on Amazon, which is the other side of my art history interests.
Renaissance people, that was Eleanor Walker. Thank you so much for joining us. Guys, we are going to keep moving forward with history on the Northern Courts in the upcoming episodes, so stay tuned. And until next time, arrivederci.